In this session, we're going to explore Booleans in 3DC printing. I'm going to start with voxels, and from the preset shelf, I'll just choose a cylinder. In the Tool Options panel, I want to make sure that Add is chosen, and then just click Apply. It's now taken this preview object, filled it with voxels, and committed it to a layer in the Voxtree layer panel. To hide this gizmo and the preview object, I can just select any other tool in the tool panel. Now I can zoom in and inspect the result. As you might notice, it's quite rough around the edges, and that's typically because there is not yet enough resolution. When you are working with voxels, you are dealing with volumetric pixels, and they are cubic in nature. So, wherever you have sharp angles, then you need quite a bit more resolution in order to maintain sharp and crisp edges. When you're working in surface mode where you're dealing with polygons, then it has a few tricks that it can utilize to optimize the mesh where you need the resolution. Surface mode has its own advantages, as we'll look at here momentarily, but voxels do as well. They have their own unique benefits. Let's go ahead and increase the resolution by clicking this icon at the bottom of the tool panel. We could also click Res Plus here to do the same thing, or we could resample it. So you want to resample once you already have the object, but if we know ahead of time that we need more resolution, what we can do is simply add resolution ahead of time on the layer when we're working in voxels. This is tantamount to increasing the dots per inch on a Photoshop document. In 3D Coat, when you're working with voxels, it's a similar concept where you have to increase the voxels per unit. So let's just go ahead and clear this object from this layer. Let's go back to the Primitives tool, and again, we want this really crisp edge. All I need to do is increase the resolution. When I click on that icon, it gives some indication how many times it's subdivided or increased the voxels per unit. With that done, let's increase it one more time. You have to be careful. If you have a large scale, it's like working with a large document in Photoshop. So again, it's the very same concept. Just think of Photoshop when you're working with voxels. Let's hit Apply or the Enter key. Oops. Somehow it got switched to Subtract, and that's not what I want. Let's hit Apply. Alright, now let's step out of the tool and inspect the result. It's a little bit rough, but nowhere near as rough as it was before. So I'm going to zoom in, and I'll hit the W key to turn wireframe on. It doesn't look like wireframe's on at this point, but if I zoom in, you can see that it indeed is on. Now, let's smooth the entire object by clicking Smooth All a few times. I can turn wireframe off, and this may be a perfectly fine result in many cases. It just takes a little getting used to working with voxels. If you want really crisp edges, you need to probably exaggerate to some degree the resolution, because you can always scale it back down just like you can in Photoshop. We can also use the cutoff tool. You can use the pose tool and just kind of scale it along a local axis to really flatten out parts that you've selected. So let's go ahead and add something in here. Let's use a model instead this time. And I'll choose something like that. Auto scale. Let's go ahead and perform a subtractive operation by choosing Subtract, and I'll hit Apply. When you click a model from the Models palette, it automatically puts you into the Import tool. It's also identical to when you're working with primitives. Again, you have the different Boolean modes that you can choose from. So let's inspect the result. Fairly nice, but let's undo this real quick. I see all this faceting, so I can subdivide the mesh ahead of time. Alright, now let's go ahead and hit Apply. I can step out of that tool, see the result, no more faceting. And let's add something to it. We'll use this one. we'll do the same thing as far as subdividing it. I'll scale it. Now I'm going to show a different way that you can perform a Boolean without having to use either the import tool or the primitives tool. I'm just going to bring this in and apply it as another layer. Got to make sure that I'm in additive mode. Before I hit apply, I want to make sure I've got quite a bit of resolution on that layer. Okay. Can inspect the result. I'm going to create another copy so that one is going to be a cutting object and then the other one is going to remain in place as a separate layer. So I'll hide this object. This copy I'm going to use as a cutter. When you hold down the control key and come to the right side of the layer where you have the little move icon, you can drag that right on top of the layer. Cut it out. So I'm going to undo. And let's go to orthographic view, top view, right click to zoom in. Let's use temporarily the cutoff tool with the ellipse. I'm just going to click and drag. And if I need to reposition it while I'm dragging, I can hold down space bar and move it just like I would in Photoshop. And once I've got it in place, I can release the space bar, then release the mouse. And that should have cut through this secondary object. Alright. So the cutoff tool actually is another means of creating Booleans. It just does it with a shape. You can also bring in black and white images, and 3DCoat will create a shape or a spline from it. You can use logos. If you have an EPS file that you've exported from Adobe Illustrator, you could use those as well. Again, as opposed to holding down the control key, if I wanted to merge this with the original object, then I would hold the shift key instead as I click and drag and drop it onto the original. But in this case, I don't necessarily want to do that. I want to use a right click menu. I can choose to intersect with, I can merge with. You've got a number of different options. Let's choose subtract from. It gives you a list, or we could choose this little picker. So let's choose that. And now I can pick the object. This separate object that it created after the Boolean, I can have 3DCoat separate if I want. I go to the geometry menu and under Objectify, Separate, I can click that and 3DCoat will separate this one onto its own layer. Alright, so I have this other copy on a separate layer if I need. You can use the transform tool to move it. So that's working with voxels. Now let's see the benefits of using surface mode instead. I'll just start with a brand new scene and let's choose surface approach. I'll choose the same type of object. I don't need to be concerned with layer resolution or scale when I'm using surface mode because I'm working strictly with polygons, so it's an entirely different platform. Click the icon to switch between the modes interchangeably once you have an object committed. When you import an object, either from outside of 3DCoat or you use an object from the models palette, what you see is what you get. Even with this primitive with a very sharp edge, I don't need to add any resolution. I can just go ahead and hit apply. Let's hit the W key. I can see the wireframe. 3DCoat applies subdivision along the edges because it deems it necessary. So yeah, surface mode is really good for very sharp edges. Now let's just do a few Boolean operations to this. I'll turn wireframe off and let's choose something like this pill. Maybe scale it down, flatten it just a bit. Okay. I probably want to subdivide that one as well to get rid of the faceting. Let's hit apply again. Does it pretty fast. If you have rather simple shapes, 3D Coat has no problem doing merging or subtracting operations in surface mode. Let's choose the sphere. You can scale it just a bit. And now if I hit apply, once more, 3D Coat really has no problem with that whatsoever. Let's undo. And if I want to merge, I'll choose add. I'll hit apply. So some shapes it has no problem at all, but if I try to add something that's fairly complex, then there is a high probability that you'll be prompted with an error message regarding the inability to complete the Boolean operation. So let me choose something that's a little bit more complex, something like this. The downside to using surface mode in this way when you have something that's rather complex is you don't know until it's done calculating whether it will work or not. When you're working with voxels, you don't have to worry about that. It will work. It's just a matter of resolution. Let's go ahead and try to add, and automatically right up front I get mesh Boolean operation failed. This usually happens when meshes have self-intersection. So yeah, if it's a complex shape, then your merging operations may not happen. So it's really a good practice to try and use voxels anytime you want to merge objects together. Let's look at another example. Undo a few times. And we want to do an intersection here. Let's scale this just a bit. Split does just as the name implies. It's practically the same thing as using the split tool. In this case, you're using either an imported object or a primitive, whereas the split tool will use shapes from the E panel in order to perform the operation. 3D Coat is going to split apart whatever volume resides inside the preview object and place that split part into its own new layer. So let's choose intersect this time. Now hit apply. This is a really powerful way of working when you want to create a kit bashing tool set. So I've already created a new folder for kit bashing. You can come up with some really unique shapes that you never even thought about when using these different Boolean types, especially intersection. The great part about this is I can just drag and drop this layer directly into the models palette. I'll get a decimation dialog that allows me to reduce the poly count. It's going to optimize the mesh. It's going to give me more resolution in the areas it thinks I need it, such as edges or high detail areas. And then in areas where it's more flat, it's going to reduce the poly count. In this case, let's not reduce it much. Right, okay. So now if I want, I can actually undo and go back to the original, but still have this object that I've created stored on my hard drive. Once created, I can reuse it in this scene or any future project. So that's a quick look at Booleans in 3DC printing. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.